The world is a powerful force and it is constantly pressuring us to conform to its values, to its priorities, and to its ways. Last time we began to talk about that and how the world wants us to conform. We don't always realize all the subtle cues that are around us that are pulling at us, like literal billboards sometimes. We can see them. At other times, they are far more subtle. And the shift that happens within our souls is a lot less noticeable. We must realize, like we said last time, that there is a God of this age. And he wants us to move away from the Lord of hosts, any way he can get us to move away from him. Therefore, this world which is following his lead will urge us to compromise our convictions for the sake of comfort, acceptance, or even survival. This is something that we noted with Daniel and his friends. They were under this kind of pressure, being taken from their homes and being placed in this pagan land. They are surrounded by people who are not committed to God's ways and who want them to conform. And yet, in the midst of this, Daniel takes a stand. Despite the dangers to himself, and his comrades follow his lead. They form a remnant. And this remnant wasn't satisfied to compromise conviction, and it chose to stand without compromise. This didn't mean, though, that they were arrogant. We talked about that. But they did follow the revealed will of God with reverence and respect. Now, we might ask, what are the consequences of living such an uncompromised life? And we would be lying to say that there's always a positive outcome. This is not a name it and claim it kind of thing. This is not a health and wealth kind of situation. Sometimes you live for God and you will suffer. There are martyrs who can attest to that. There are saints who can attest to that. Jeremiah was mistreated around the same time as this is happening because of his faithfulness to God. This is part of the potential cost that we must count when we decide to worship God and to serve him. We must realize that it may be a choice that could cost us our lives. It could certainly cost us our freedom and our desires. But we also would be falling into another ditch to say that that's always the way it is. Because most often, we will not be called to suffer quite in that same way. We will suffer many times and in many ways, but the Lord has plans that do not include, say, martyrdom. Sometimes he may also have plans to put people into positions of influence. This is what we see with Daniel and his friends. And so whatever the Lord's plans are for us, there are certain results of living an uncompromised life. And this is something that we do have to consider and evaluate. If we are committed to the Lord, then we will find that an uncompromising life first is bold. It's bold. And that's certainly what we see with Daniel here, a boldness and kind of bravery. Second, we will also note that an uncompromising life is blessed. It's blessed. The Lord blesses Daniel and his friends for their choices here. The third thing we will see is that an uncompromised life is recognized. An uncompromised life is recognized. And it certainly is, even by the king. But let's look at the first of those. First, an uncompromising life is bold. Let's look again, verses 11 through 16, larger portion of our text here. But Daniel said to the overseer, whom the commander of the officials had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days, and let us be given some vegetables to eat and water to drink. And then let our appearance be observed in your presence, and the appearance of the youths who are eating the king's choice food, and deal with your servants according to what you see. So he listened to them in this matter, and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, their appearance seemed better, and they were fatter than all the youths who had been eating the king's choice food. So the overseer continued to withhold their choice food and the wine they were to drink, and kept giving them vegetables. Now you'll remember that Daniel had already asked Ashpenaz about this. He was the commander of the officials, or the chief eunuch, as some of your translations have there. He had asked if they could abstain from the meat and wine from the king's table. Why? Because he didn't want to be defiled by it. Now, we saw that God had granted Daniel favor in his sight, but he still responded in the negative. Why? Because he was afraid of the king. He was afraid that this choice could cost him his head. And so, for most people, we would think, well, that's the end of that. You know what? We asked, he said no. What else can we do? Well, Daniel doesn't stop there. God seems to grant him a kind of boldness. And he gets that boldness as well as an idea here. He doesn't just give up, but he instead turns to a lower ranking official, described here as the overseer. This is a term that's sometimes translated as steward or guardian. Now, the King James transliterates this Hebrew noun as a name. It just misinterprets this, thinks it's a name, Melzar. But it doesn't look like this is a name. This is actually a word or a noun that describes his role rather than a proper noun that would be his name. This is a role of oversight, not merely guarding, but also nurturing these youths, making sure that they get raised up and adjusted to Babylonian society. And so he would be one who is charged with making sure they conform to the culture, conform to the world, as it were. He was directly responsible for their care. He was a subordinate to Ashpenaz. Well, Daniel's choice to approach this overseer shows his strategic boldness that God had planted within him. He approached what we could describe as a lesser magistrate, someone who is under the chief official, someone who is more directly above him, someone who is responsible for this very thing, for their daily provisions. Maybe this person would even have less of a risk to himself than Ashpenaz would have, should the situation turn and Daniel and his friends look more haggard than the other youths. So this takes into consideration the chief official's concerns. And Daniel's proposal in verse 12 here is humble, and it's also tactful. He begins with the word please. And of course, hopefully the kids all learn that the word please is a very important word that we need to use in our lives, and that is a word that you don't stop using as you get older. Some older people need to learn that the word please is still an important word. And he says, please test your servants for 10 days and let us be given some vegetables to eat and water to drink. We were talking about this at potluck, or just before potluck, um, the different kinds of vegetables we might be imagining, And I said sometimes it's anachronistic, but for some reason, as I read this, I always get this flavor in my mouth of these buttery roasted vegetables, and that's not quite what they would have had, but nonetheless, that's what I get, kind of in my, well, there's the mind's mind. I guess there's also the mind's mouth, right? That's what I picture in my mind. Just these good vegetables. Um, and of course, we got lots of good vegetables today, and lots of great dips for those vegetables. There's nothing like a roasted vegetable with some honey mustard dip or something like that. Of course, sometimes you might take a little cheese and melt it with your peas, or get some green beans and put some bouillon in there, and roast that together with a little salt, kosher salt, and a little oil. And yeah, it gets to be good. There are some good vegetable choices out there, but the Hebrew word here, which is translated pulse in the King James, does not, or is not, I should say, restricted to only vegetables. We can talk about which vegetables they had, but this isn't a word that's restricted only to vegetables. It literally means from the seed, and it would include also grains like wheat and barley, and it would also include perhaps some fruits. So we might look at this and say, well, maybe this is a pretty healthy diet, and maybe it was in a way, but it's also potentially high carb, and there's little to no protein. I mean, depending on what vegetables we're talking about here, or what may be provided there, they may not be getting any protein at all in their diet. Now we might think, okay, well, they're getting water, and studies show the benefits of drinking water. Sometimes it's hard to get our kids to eat their vegetables, and it's hard to get our kids to drink water. Sometimes it's hard to get adults to drink water too. The water is beneficial. It is helpful, of course, especially in a culture that takes in way too many sugars and caffeines, I guess, in their drinks. We do need to have more water. Is this what Daniel was thinking of? There are some people who have looked at this and said, Daniel's presenting us with the perfect diet. No, he's not. This is not necessarily a great health food diet that he is presenting to us. He's just simply trying to avoid the meat that's been sacrificed to idols and the wine that's been sacrificed to idols. In fact, if you think about it, plain water back then is not like plain water today. It was full of disease oftentimes. It was dangerous sometimes to just pull water out of a well, water that had passed through all kinds of product in the soil before it got to the well. Water that might have all kinds of microbial life as they pull it up. What the Jews and the Gentiles typically did with the water was to mix in a little bit of wine. Why? Because the alcohol would kill anything in that water that would make a person sick. So Daniel's diet was not necessarily the healthiest diet, not by their standards, certainly, and maybe not even by our standards. We might say, this is pretty dangerous what you're doing here, Daniel. But he's trusting the Lord. He's trusting the Lord. Unlike the rich food and wine found on the king's table, which was likely dedicated to idols, once again, verse 8, These foods were clean according to the Mosaic law. And by avoiding the wine, he is underscoring the fact that he wants to avoid anything that's associated with pagan worship. He just wants to honor the Lord. But as he makes this request, he's also placing a reasonable time constraint on the request. 10 days. The Babylonian officials would assume, and I would argue rightly so, that Daniel and his friends would appear weaker at the end of this 10-day period than the other youths who were enjoying a full diet. This would give them a chance, 10 days would give them a chance to test their theory without providing any danger to Ashpenaz, the chief official, or to anyone else. But of course, Daniel is trusting that God will use this period to demonstrate his faithfulness through the test. And so it's not just a bold proposal that he is presenting here and asking a second time. He is also demonstrating a bold faith in knowing that God is going to get him through whatever it is that's going to happen in the next 10 days. And so he continues on, verse 13. He calls for an objective evaluation. He says, "Let our appearance, our countenance, be observed in your presence, and the appearance of the youths who are eating the king's choice food." This is an empirical test. This is a scientific test right here. Daniel and his friends are saying they will be the control group. We are the ones being tested here. You look at us, watch our appearance, take a look. How do we appear after that 10-day period? You investigate us personally. You inspect us personally. And this ensures an objective comparison between them and the other youths. Daniel's willing to let the results speak for themselves. God is not just the God of heaven. He's also the creator. And he is God over all. His ways are visible to those who inspect them. And so Daniel is inviting that inspection. This is going to be a moment that glorifies God. So what's the result of his boldness? Well, in verse 14, we read that the overseer agrees. He agrees to this test. Sometimes you might imagine that he may have been talking to someone who was stern. Someone, no. Get back there. You're going to do as you're told. But no, God granted him that grace, right? This decision probably even required Ashpenaz's approval, as the overseer was under his authority. So this also might demonstrate more of what we saw in verse 9, that God had granted Daniel favor in the sight of the commander of the officials. In other words, God is moving the hearts of those pagan officials to accept Daniel's request. As Proverbs 21:1 says, "The king's heart is like channels of water in the hand of the Lord. He turns it wherever he wishes." This is something to tell us, or something to teach us right here. It doesn't matter who's over us, whose authority is over us. So we trust in the Lord and we commit to living an uncompromised life. We can know that the Lord will watch out for us, and the Lord will help us to navigate those who are above us in authority, even in a foreign land. And of course, in verse 15, we indeed see the miraculous results. It's the end of the 10-day period, and their appearance, we read, seemed better, and they were fatter than all the youths who had been eating the king's choice food. You might say they were fatter. That's interesting. And I don't know, maybe you've been eating vegetables, and some of those vegetables, uh, again, I obviously enjoy food. Uh, some of the vegetables that we have today, if you pour a ton of Velveeta cheese on top of your broccoli or something, and it's just as much cheese as it is broccoli, you're probably not getting as much of the health benefits out of that, right? But this fatter here is not talking about obesity. This is talking about health. This is talking about their health in comparison, or we might say in contrast, to the other youths. As the Net Bible captures here, it says their bodies were healthier. Their bodies were healthier. So that might be another way of translating this. Their bodies were healthier. And so, on a diet of vegetables, grains, and water, they had a notable increase developmentally over the other youth. They had grown muscle and vitality. There's more fullness to them in comparison. Obviously, these are younger men who are still growing, but you might expect that if you give a bunch of teenage boys lots of steak and lots of meat and lots of protein, and then you give another set of teenage boys a bunch of carbs and a bunch of vegetables, the boys with the protein are going to look a little bit bigger and stronger at the end of a time period than the boys who are eating just the vegetables. Why do I highlight this? Because this is the work of God. This is not the work of human reasoning. This is a miracle. That's why I say this is not a diet plan. Now, I know there are people out there who write books and say, okay, you need to buy my book because I've got the Daniel diet and you can lose weight. It's always amusing to me that the pastor who wrote that is very overweight. And after he wrote that, he still remains to be very overweight. But that's beside the point. It's like trusting a faith healer who wears glasses. Why, if you're a faith healer, why do you need glasses? Um, it is amusing to me, but this is not a diet plan here. This is a work of God. This is a miracle. Something that defies natural expectations. And think about this. How is it that any diet should produce such notable results after 10 days? I mean, that is a short period of time. You might lose a couple of pounds in 10 days, unless you're doing some kind of dangerous crash diet. You might, lose a few more than a couple of pounds, but that is not going to be a healthier outcome for you at the end of that. No, this is something that where they are having superior results in a short amount of time compared to people who are having a full diet. They are restricting their diet and they're having better results. What are they proving here? They're proving what Jesus said in Matthew 4, which is actually what he has said back in Deuteronomy chapter 8. Man shall not live by bread alone. This is not about the food that we eat. This is about honoring God. This is a miracle. This is divine intervention. And the overseer is convinced by the results. And so he makes the change permanent. We see that in verse 16. Even an unbeliever can't deny the work of God. And that's what we see with biblical miracles. No one could say that Jesus wasn't healing people, right? Oh, well, that person just said he had a back pain, and now he's okay. It's not something you can see. No, that person walked up and he was missing an arm. Or you walked up and he was withered from birth, and all of a sudden now he can get up and walk. He was lame, now he can walk. He was blind, now he can see. That's how the miracles of God work. And this test, the test's success, validates Daniel's faith, and it ensures their continued adherence to God's standards. Now, the question is, when you face difficult circumstances like this, do you have the same boldness? How do you respond to such situations in your life? In fact, as one commentator notes here, when it comes to solving the problems of life, we must ask God for the courage to face the problem humbly and honestly, the wisdom to understand it, and the strength to do what he tells us to do, and the faith to trust him to do the rest. Our motive must be the glory of God and not finding a way of escape. I'll read that line again. Our motive must not be, our motive must be the glory of God and not finding a way of escape. The important question isn't, how can I get out of this? But what can I get out of this? The Lord used this private test to prepare Daniel and his friends for the public tests they would face in years to come. The best thing about this experience wasn't that they were delivered from compromise, as wonderful as that is, but that they were developed in character. No wonder God called Daniel greatly beloved, for he was very much like his beloved son. An uncompromising life receives boldness from God. And it's rooted in a faith that trusts God to act. Now, it isn't arrogant. Daniel's respectful approach shows us how to stand firm without alienating others. God not only grants, but also honors such a bold faith, even preparing us for greater tests that God might have for us down the road, especially as our trust in God's faithfulness grows. But this is a gift from God. And that brings us to the next point here. An uncompromising life is blessed. It's blessed. Verse 17 says, "As for these four youths, God gave them knowledge and intelligence in every branch of literature and wisdom. Daniel even understood all kinds of visions and dreams." Now, we might consider the decision to withhold the defiling food as a win for these young men, and of course it is. But God isn't finished with just that blessing. They are now going to be endowed with everything they need to rise to new positions that God has planned for them in the future. Sometimes a trial will give way to abundant blessings in our life, and we don't always know that. Note that this is a nod again to God's sovereignty, because we read here that God gave. Verse 2 said that God gave King Jehoiakim over to judgment. Verse 9 said that God can give a person favor in the sight of another. And here we see that God can give intelligence. You know, we wrongly think of intelligence as static. This is one of the things that I talk about when I do tutoring, because sometimes off and on I do tutoring. Intelligence is not something that's static, especially as people get very, very obsessed over intelligent quotients and things like that. That is not something that remains the same over time. You can increase or decrease your IQ based on how much thinking you do, your diet, your health, your lifestyle, all of that can affect these things. And God can grant intelligence, God can grant wisdom, God can grant knowledge. He did that here with he did that with Solomon, excuse me, not here, but back in First Kings. You might remember First Kings 3:12. If you don't, go ahead and turn there. First Kings 3:12. If you're not exactly sure where First Kings is, it is right before Second Kings. So that'll help you find it there. It's nice how that works out. They are in order. First Kings 3:12. God says, "Behold, I have done according to your words." This is God speaking to Solomon. "Behold, I have given you a wise and discerning heart, so that there has been no one like you before, nor shall one like you arise after you." Now, that doesn't mean that God's going to stop giving wisdom and discerning hearts. And we see that God does give this also to Daniel and to his friends as well. In Daniel 2:21, we read that he gives wisdom to wise men and knowledge to men of understanding. So if we find ourselves lacking, we can seek the Lord, and he can help us. He grants both wisdom and knowledge and intelligence as he sees fit. There may be times he withholds from us for his purposes, but we should never, ever see our current condition as immutable. If we want more from God and we feel like we need more from God for a particular situation, what does he do? He invites us to ask. James 1, ask, right? If you lack wisdom, ask. And he grants it, in this case, not just in general, but applying it to, quote, every branch of literature and wisdom. He can even help them to learn. To learn what? To learn the Chaldean curriculum. Oh, really? Yes. What did that include? That included sciences. Okay, that sounds good. Astrology. Oh, maybe not so good on astrology. Omen reading. Oh, maybe not so good on that. And divination practices. Oh, maybe not so good on that either. But they could do that. This is what they studied in the Chaldean schools. One study notes that this included the examination of livers, kidneys. You might think, oh, so like a scientific. No, 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 no. Livers, kidneys, and other animal entrails, and the examination of organs and flight patterns of birds. This was all for the purpose of omen reading and for divination. Now, could they have also gained some valuable scientific knowledge with this? Possibly, but you can see that it was not always used for purely intellectual pursuits. This was also used for what the Bible would condemn. And to be clear, Daniel and his friends did not engage in divination. We don't ever read that. They read it, they understood it, and they didn't do it. They didn't do it. They could interact with the information of their day in a God-honoring way without being drawn away to the world. That too is part of God's protection, where we can study the things of this world and not be tempted by them or not be led away by them. They demonstrate, in fact, more maturity by God's grace than most adults do. To be able to read this stuff and say, okay, well, let's try it out. Let's all get together and one night away from everyone else and try it out. They didn't do that kind of thing. They read it. They understood it wasn't pleasing to God. They also understood what the people did so that they had an understanding for themselves, and they just weren't drawn away by it. This is part of the gift that God gave them. Now, God also singles out Daniel for a particular gift that we read here, that Daniel was able to understand, or that he understood, all kinds of visions and dreams. Now, this foreshadows what he's going to be doing in the rest of the book. This is chapter 1. This gets us into the other chapters. What is he going to be doing in chapter 2, chapter 7, chapter 8? He's going to be interpreting visions and dreams, and he's going to be engaged in these things. In fact, as the Reformation Study Bible notes here, this is like Joseph in Pharaoh's court. Daniel here had the ability to interpret dreams and visions, which set him apart as God's spokesperson. Now, if there's any doubt here, these are real divine revelations. And this is something that Daniel had that the others didn't have, with all of their study, with all of their divination and all their practices. Daniel actually had the ability to receive divine revelation because he was a prophet of God. What revelations was he receiving? Well, he was receiving a vision or visions, which typically take place when the prophet is awake, and he was receiving dreams, which, of course, take place while the prophet is asleep. This would have been highly valued among the Babylonians, right? Among the Chaldeans, among the wise men. They would have coveted this in Daniel. How is it that you have this and we don't have this? But this gift isn't so much for Daniel's benefit, is it? It's for God's glory. It's so that God can be glorified in him. And it's an example of how an uncompromising life can receive God's blessings. Now, often these blessings are blessings that are able to equip us for whatever service that God has planned for us in the future. Now, God may not grant us the same gifts that Daniel had, but we can pray to God, like I said, for wisdom. Again, James 1:17 says that every good thing given and every perfect gift is from above. And so whatever we need, wisdom, strength, opportunities, God will answer those prayers from us. Especially if we're living an uncompromised life, we will receive the blessings that we need from God, especially for the tasks that he assigns. Now, as we read this, you might say, okay, maybe God would also still grant dreams and visions today. And that's a question that comes up every once in a while. Now, these revelations were common in Bible times, but now that the canon of Scripture is complete, it's not necessary. If a dream or a vision contradicted the Bible, we would say that's false. It's something to be rejected. If it's in alignment with the Bible, and as John Owen said, it's unnecessary because we already had the Bible. We didn't need the dream and the vision. I'm not saying that God can't use a dream every once in a while to help us to understand something a little bit about ourselves or about the world. But we shouldn't be expecting new revelation from God right now. We should instead hold on to the revelation that God has given to us, especially to ensure that whatever we are doing aligns with his will. Now, will others be able to tell if God has provided such a blessing for an uncompromised life? Yes. Yes, they will. And that brings us to the final point here. An uncompromising life is recognized. An uncompromising life is recognized. And so verses 18 through 21 here, we read then, at the end of the days, which the king had specified for presenting them, the commander of the officials presented them before Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and out of them all, not one was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's personal service. As for every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king consulted them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and conjurers who were in all his realm. And Daniel continued until the first year of Cyrus the king. The education and training of these youths, as we said, lasted for about 3 years. That was the Persian system, that was also the Babylonian system here. And at the end of the time, they would have to face King Nebuchadnezzar himself. And so when that time came, Ashpenaz brings them before the king. And that has got to have been a moment of high tension for the youths, as well as for Ashpenaz and the other officials who were there, because if the youths didn't do well, then it didn't go well for them either. So this was probably a fairly tense time. I do find it interesting too in verse 18, this phrase, the end of days. Um, it just means the end of the time there, but uh, perhaps there's a little bit of a foreshadowing to the future themes of this book, the future eschatological themes that we find unfolding in Daniel. But this was the time for the king's own personal examination. Now it's time for him to examine these men, these young men. So in verse 19, he conducts the interviews. He will see for himself what his officials have accomplished over time. And he finds that out of them all, not one was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. This indicates that they are unparalleled in their excellence, right? They are set apart by God granted wisdom. And so we read that they enter the king's personal services. Again, there's so many parallels between what we read here with Daniel and with Daniel's friends and with Joseph. Because Joseph had a very similar outcome as he faced Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. Now, Daniel and his friends are having a similar situation before this pagan king. And they are being elevated to positions of influence, serving as advisors in the king's court. As one commentary notes here, Daniel, as he's writing this, by the way, Daniel was not boasting by including this information, for he had already made it clear that his wisdom was a gift from God. What he is doing is he's exalting God. He's saying, God did this. God made it this way. That these youths from this backwater nation called Judah could come into the great nation of Babylon with all of its wise men, all of its worldly education, and they have more knowledge, they have more understanding than all of the other youths. That's something that God accomplished, and praise God for it. So this next verse continues to explain and highlight their superiority, and it says that they were 10 times better than all the magicians and conjurers. What does that mean, 10 times better? Is that like, did they have kind of a scale, a rubric, and they were able to say, okay, well, this is 2 times better and this is 3 times better? No, this is an expression. And this is an expression that we do see in a couple of places in the Bible, like in Genesis 31:7. And it's probably an expression that just means that an expression of of uh, of exponential superiority, I guess I could put it that way. This is all to God's glory, though. This is all to God's glory. And so Daniel and his friends receive the blessing of the Lord, and of course they're going to need the blessing of the Lord. Why? Because look at their coworkers. Because these are going to be their coworkers, right? These are going to be the people that they work with, the magicians and the conjurers. Now, what do we know about these? Well, magicians. What do you think of when you think of a magician? You think of a guy perhaps in a tuxedo, and he pulls rabbits out of hats. Is that what they had back then? No, that is not what they had back then. In fact, these magicians were occultists who spent most of their time as scribes, chronicling information like the movement of stars for divine information. And so some translations even render this astrologers. They were astrologers, but they didn't just do astrology, they also um, studied omens and dream interpretation. Daniel is going to be superior to them in their dream interpretation. There were also the conjurers. Who were the conjurers? Those who conjure things, the enchanters, those who cast spells and engaged in necromancy. What is that? Oh, you may have heard of like necrotic flesh, that's dead flesh. Necromancers are people who commune with the dead. They speak to dead spirits, or at least they claim to. Some are probably lying. A lot of them probably are lying. But at least once we know, with the Witch of Endor, for instance, that she surprisingly made contact. And so sometimes it's real. And this is certainly nothing to play with. None of this is anything to play with. Of course, in our world, people might poo-poo this. They might look at this and say, "Oh, that's some ancient dark time. That's what the people believed back then." The world's not like that today. Ah, but is that the case? This is a post-Christian culture. As this is a post-Christian culture, and people are inherently, I mean, it is within our DNA to be religious because God has written eternity in their hearts. Well, we will fill the void with something if we get rid of Christianity. One commentary notes these pagan practices today seem distant and frankly ridiculous to most people, yet throughout the centuries there have been those committed to such activities. With the rise of certain modern religious movements communicating with the spirit world through mediums or channels called witches and sorcerers in the Bible is becoming popular. There are popular forums today where people can get on and participate with these. I know I've shared it before, but there's that headline not too many years ago that there are currently more witches in the United States than there are Presbyterians. And that's pretty stunning to consider because we don't think of that kind of thing as being that popular, but it is. It's growing in popularity because we all will worship something. And if you remove Christ from culture, then chaos will ensue. But we need not fear. Daniel and his friends, empowered by God, surpassed all of these pagan conjurers and magicians. And we, when we are walking in the Spirit, not according to the flesh, can be assured that none of these things will harm us. This book exalts God's wisdom above the world's, and the same God reigns today. He is an unchanging God. He is the same yesterday and today and forever. And so look at this as the passage concludes. Daniel continued until the first year of Cyrus the king. Now, this means that Daniel made it through the entire Babylonian captivity. What did this chapter open with? The Babylonian captivity in verses 1 and 2. we see here in verse 21 a summary of Daniel's life. He makes it through. And despite all the people who would hate him, all of the magicians and conjurers, despite Nebuchadnezzar, despite uh, anyone else, Daniel survives. And he survives the entire captivity. Uh, Cyrus's decree comes out in the year 539 BC. Daniel has a life in Babylon that spans at least to Cyrus the king. We don't know if he didn't live beyond that, but he lives through the entire Babylonian captivity, at least 6 decades. He makes it through the entire time. How? Because he's blessed of God. And because no matter what regime changes happened in Babylon, no matter who he faced, they recognized God's blessing upon him. And they recognized that he was living an uncompromised life. They challenged it and they lost. God is faithful to sustain his servants in pagan environments. And so let's not forget that. Let's not forget that we can too be faithful here today. We can be faithful where we are in our nation. We can be a light that is set upon a hill, that is shining out into the darkness. We can be faithful. We can glorify God, and we can live a life of non-compromise with this world. We might even find ourselves elevated to spheres of influence with people around us. And we will find that God will give us the words to speak in those times. Well, Daniel here shows us the results of an uncompromised life. It is bold. It is blessed. And it is recognizable. It will stand out. Daniel and his friends certainly stood out in that pagan culture. We'll see pretty soon they literally stand out as others bow. They trust God and they honor their faith. Their boldness led to a miraculous working of God. Their faithfulness brought about divine blessings. Their excellence was acknowledged by the pagan king. And through it all, it is actually God who is strengthening them to be able to live an uncompromised life. It is God who's giving them that power. So as believers, we will face similar pressures, but guess what? We can resist them. We can resist them. When God calls us to, whether God calls us to suffer or to serve in places of influence, we can trust him to work through us for his glory. And so let's ask for the courage to live boldly, the faith to seek his blessings, and the humility to let our lives point others to him.